Good evening, everybody. My name's Tom Rains. I'm a research fellow in the Europe programme here at Chatham House. Thank you all very much for coming out this evening. It's obviously an absolutely packed crowd, and we will try and get in as many questions as we can once we've heard from each of the speakers here this evening. It's obviously been a remarkable and momentous few days in British politics. We've had this extraordinary and unexpected, in many ways, result in the EU referendum. We've had a Prime Minister resign. We've had huge shocks in financial and currency markets, and not quite sure how to describe what's happening in the Labour Party at the moment, but it's sort of semi-coup d'etat, as it were. So this evening's event gives us a chance to discuss all these issues from a few different angles, and we've got a great panel here to do that. Immediately to my left is Professor Matthew Goodwin. He is a visiting senior fellow on the Europe programme at Chatham House. He's been an associate with us for a number of years. He's also a senior fellow at the ESRC's UK in a Changing Europe programme and a professor at the University of Kent. I think I got all of that right. Robin Niblett, all of you will know, is the director of Chatham House, and Paolo Sabacci is the research director for international economics. So we have a strong Chatham House team here to digest what we've seen over the last few days. This evening's event is on the record. It's not under the Chatham House rule. You should feel free to tweet about it. Please do that not with the normal hashtag, which is CHEvents, but instead with the hashtag Brexit, which allows us to join the global conversation about what's happening and sort of link all our tweets to that. So to kick off, I'm going to turn to Matt. We saw polls going one way, forecasts in financial markets and betting markets really not expecting the result that we got, even up to sort of 11 o'clock at night. What did we get wrong, and what happened on the night that was so unexpected?
Well, firstly, what a few days in British politics. I think it was sort of best summed up to me on Friday morning, where we had Brexit, and then the pound was tumbling, and David Cameron resigned, and a journalist from the Financial Times walked up to me and said, "It's a rather strange day. The resignation of the Prime Minister is only our third most important story." Well, that sort of sums up the chaos of what we've seen. I think foremost we collectively, in terms of pollsters and analysts and the Westminster debate, whatever you want to call it, we underestimated the power of Euroscepticism, and we underestimated the motives, the strength of feeling among a particular section of British society. This referendum, if you just look at England, was not even close. If you just look at England, Leave won this referendum by 7 percentage points. Okay, so second referendum, I'm not sure I would want to go down that line if I was firmly in the Remain camp at this point. And if you look at where the votes for Brexit were strongest, it's a familiar story. It's a story that we've been talking about here in our reports for 5 years or so, which is a story about a part of Britain that has had a fundamentally different experience with globalisation, with European integration, and has felt left behind economically, and has felt culturally under threat from free movement and from migration, but has also looked at London and looked at the middle class media and political consensus and the values that surround that particular community, and has said, actually, that's not for me. And just to put this in statistics, so this is from a piece that's coming out in Politico tomorrow. If you look at the 20 local authorities where support for remaining in the EU was strongest, 45% of voters have a university degree, 42% are professional, 26% describe themselves as non-white, only 11% are pensioners, and the median income is £27,000. Now, if you look at the 20 local authorities where the Brexit vote was strongest, only 16% of voters have a degree, only 23% are professional, less than 5% describe themselves as non-white, nearly 20% are pensioners, and the median income is £18,000. Big differences between these groups, big differences in how they see the world and how they're experiencing the world. It is certainly true that more leafy, affluent Conservative areas, South Bucks, Chichester, West Dorset, also gave Brexit a majority vote. And in doing so, they turned their backs on David Cameron, who will now be remembered principally alongside Anthony Eden and Tony Blair as a Prime Minister who will only be remembered for one thing: pulling Britain out of the European Union and potentially also triggering the complete dissolution of the United Kingdom if we have a second referendum.
We saw, so there was some, the main story as it emerged at the beginning of the evening was Leave outperforming expectations.
Leave outperformed expectations across the board. Even in the Eastern Eurosceptic heartlands where it was already going to be a majority, turnout was much higher than people expected. The problem for the Remain camp came in Scotland and London, where turnout was lower, although differential turnout would not have led to a different result anyway. But it is worth noting that in the London districts today, where support for a second referendum is strongest, namely Camden and Hackney, they were also in the top 10% for having the lowest turnout at the first referendum. So there is a real sort of, to me, that's evidence that the Remain camp failed to inspire and failed to mobilise their vote. But just one quick point as well. It isn't just, this sort of London versus the rest divide. The problem as well here, I think, is that Europe and immigration became fused about 6 years ago in the British mindset, largely because of the rise of UK Independence Party. But that really opened up a door for Brexit in the Labour heartlands. I mean, Labour now has a really big problem. This isn't about Jeremy Corbyn. This is about a deep structural problem that runs through the Labour electorate. On one side are urban, middle class, professional, cosmopolitan, progressive voters at ease with Europe, at ease with immigration, and on the other side are voters in Merthyr Tydfil, Mansfield, Walsall, Stoke-on-Trent, Sunderland, who turned out and gave Brexit over 65% of the vote.
And I'm a resident of Hackney, so I feel
you voted,
if not responsibility. I certainly did vote, but I can understand in a way it's also a sign of the way that those people who are now on the losing side in the minority, the way that they feel discombobulated and affected by the result. But just on the party dimension of this, what do we know about the way the supporters of different parties turned out, and what sort of implications does that have for our party politics, which is now in such a state of flux?
Well, we know that the generally older Conservative vote really did turn out. I don't think that was ever in question anyway. We know that older Conservatives turn out in big numbers. They did last year. We have now a growing body of evidence that younger voters did not turn out to the extent that the Remain camp were hoping that they would. And that should not have surprised anybody. And I think, more generally, looking at the party implications of all of this, you're going to now see a lot of Labour MPs, pro-EU Labour MPs, looking at electorates that delivered very big votes for Brexit. That's less of a problem for the Conservatives, because even if you're a Remain Conservative, you can change position and you can absorb that tradition. For the Labour Party, what has just happened really strikes at the core of what the Labour Party is all about. It's going to have to fundamentally rethink its stance on immigration. It can stay as a pro-EU party, but it's now going to have to somehow figure out a way of developing a coherent electorate, one that is not comprised of two groups of voters who are fundamentally at odds with one another.
Just on this question, you mentioned it a second ago, and I'm thinking of this, the divide in Labour as well that this represents. David Lammy, a Labour MP, suggested that this was all folly and we can all rethink it and maybe Parliament should. And you mentioned the notion of a second referendum and why that might not be a good idea before. What happens, and we've already seen some of the assumptions, promises, however you viewed them, of the Leave campaign slightly being rowed back on by some of the spokespeople. What happens if these voters who feel that this was their chance to shake up the system, these people who maybe have felt disenfranchised or disenchanted with Westminster politics? What happens if these voters don't get what they want in the end? If they don't get a deal with the EU that changes the rules on free movement?
Yeah, well, let's be absolutely clear about what the Brexit vote was. And this is not to make a value judgment. I'm not about to say everybody who voted for Brexit is racist or xenophobic or anything like that. But concerns over immigration were front and centre behind the Brexit vote. That is evident in every single survey you run. The only thing that I've seen that suggests otherwise is Lord Ashcroft's survey, which came out yesterday, and which is descriptive, which is not necessarily based on sort of more techie analysis. So immigration concerns delivered the Brexit vote, which is why I'm slightly confused as to why Boris Johnson, Daniel Hannan and others are now talking about, or at least talking down, the earlier pledges to reform immigration. The economically disaffected working class has just punched the political elite in the face. I would not want to give that group of voters another opportunity to vent what could be a greater sense of frustration if they're not given what they were promised during the campaign, which was reform of migration. That is really the worst thing the sort of collectively political elite could do. These are voters who have already shown their willingness to leave the mainstream arena. They've already been supporting UKIP since 2010. And one of the biggest predictors, by the way, of the Brexit vote last week was support for UKIP at the 2014 European elections. So in a way, this is a controversial point, but one that I would certainly make. Nigel Farage has emerged as a winner in all of this. Pushed for a referendum, won that referendum, but crucially politicised that economically disaffected working class and really got them into the polling stations for this vote. And that's going to force the Labour Party in particular into having to think outside the box now in terms of how it reconnects with those voters. And that's not going to be very easy for a party that seems determined to pretend, that seems determined to think this is really all about 0 hours contracts, or this is really all about economics. These voters have obviously been driven into the polling stations by something much deeper, that's as much about national identity as it is about wages and tangible goods.
On that note of economics, I want to turn to the FT's second story on the day, which was presumably the plunge in sterling and the chaos in financial markets. Paola, obviously this is as many predicted, and economists have been, and their predictions have been taken in vain over the course of this campaign, but there has been a sharp shock to the economy initially. Is that a short shock, or is there something more fundamentally happening and being driven by the uncertainty of this vote?
Well, there is certainly a lot of uncertainty, and the markets are very nervous. But I think there is a lesson we learned from the financial crisis of 2008, and the lesson is you need to show that somebody is in the driver's seat, and that's what Mark Carney did on Friday and what George Osborne did this morning. And Mark Carney promised 250 billion liquidity, and there is the swap agreements in place to provide liquidity in foreign currencies. So, and actually, another lesson, unfortunately, we learn from the financial crisis is actually that the need to have good safety net. And again, everything is possible, but we have more robust safety net in place now. And so, obviously, the governor of the Bank of England and the Chancellor are very concerned about the size of the financial sector and the banking sector in this country. And so there are these sort of firewalls around the financial sector. That doesn't obviously stop sterling to fall because there's a reaction to the news. And it doesn't stop the FTSE 100 and FTSE 250 as well to fall. But that is sort of an expected reaction. The thing is, the question we need to ask ourselves is this going to lead to a financial crisis? I don't think so. But we're going to have more problems in the real economy. And the real economy, actually, the UK was doing quite well, is doing quite well. The IMF report, Article 4 report, which was published a week before the referendum on the UK, forecast is something like 1.9% GDP, real GDP growth this year, which, by the way, is better than the Eurozone. And that somehow vindicates the argument that Brexit comes. But obviously, this was done under different conditions. So the question now, to me, the really critical question is confidence. Is confidence going to take a big plunge? Because that will impact on consumption, and consumption, private consumption, is a big driver of growth in this country, and on investment. And obviously, individuals, investors, businesses are all now on hold because you're not going to change your car if you don't know whether your job will be still there in a year time. And what we know, there are some hard facts here, and one hard fact is that the financial services will relocate some of the firms outside the EU, outside the UK in the EU for reasons that are well known. And so again, the estimate is for 100,000 losses in just the financial sector. And this just for the big banks relocated. So people are very nervous, and that will have an impact on the economy. And so we will probably see a slowdown and possibly a technical recession in the months to come. And then everything depends on the kind of agreement and how fast this agreement will be reached in order to dispel uncertainty, because people want to know where they stand, they want to make plans. Companies, firms want to know what is in the cards for them.
So in terms of expectations of a recession, I sort of saw that Goldman Sachs and the EIU are both now forecasting a recession in the UK in 2017. You think that sounds realistic?
It is plausible. It is very plausible. But again, and we move from a quite high level of growth and a quite robust economy with effectively a good level of employment into all these problems that will be created by changing the system effectively and adapting and preparing to a completely new system.
These effects on investment, when would they start to feed through into the real economy? Because there's obviously this huge uncertainty, and this was obviously a big issue before for foreign direct investors, particularly in manufacturing industries which have thrived in recent years, like the car sector, for example. Is that something where we would just expect they'll just hold on until there's clarity over the rules going forwards, or that this will be diverted into other targets?
This is already going on. This business confidence and manufacturing export orders, for example, have declined since mid-2015. So basically when the referendum was announced, we knew that was going to have a referendum. And so this is being going because as the moment this referendum came into in play, then people started to adjust. And so these are very clear. Sterling is down, but this is actually the decline has been going on again since mid-2015. And this is the longest time where the sterling has been below 1.50 against the dollar since, 15 years ago. So that's really has been going on, and it will become more and more. Obviously, we're not going to see a better situation. We're going to see a more slowdown in activities.
And I just wanted to also ask you, you obviously follow things in the rest of continental Europe very closely. What is your impression of how the shock of this has been interpreted by people and leaders in other European governments?
Well, it's shocking because Britain's always felt as part of the European family, but somehow predicted. And actually, in the continent, the big fear is exactly what Matt was saying. So the fate of the Labour Party in this country is what's happening to all progressive parties in Europe. And it's exactly the same story. We see that in France, we see that in Italy, we see that everywhere. And the big question is immigration. And that is for a combination, and in somehow a clumsy and non-logical combination of immigration and inequality, unemployment which got exacerbated after the crisis, and so on. I think they do not actually, in a logical way, they shouldn't talk to each other, and I can explain why later, but they do, and people tend to bundle together. And the tragic thing and the very frustrating thing is the progressive parties, none of them has been able to come up with a progressive agenda to address this kind of concern. So this space, as Matt said, has been occupied by the UKIP here and by all the other populist movement, whatever you want to call them, in the rest of Europe.
Robin, we've heard that the most important issue in the short term for the future of the economy is the shape of UK-EU relations going forward. Where do we go from here? There's probably a job available if you want to
swap roles again, as we were going to do earlier. I just think we're starting from such a place of mutual mistrust and misunderstanding between European governments in particular, I think more than people, European governments and the UK government. It is, Paolo said, shocking. David Cameron is claimed to have said, look, don't worry, I'm going to win this one. I know you're not happy I did it, but don't worry, I can win this. But if you're sitting in an EU capital, and like Paolo, I get to travel around a fair amount, here is the UK, the country that pushed the enlargement process, one of the most active at pushing the enlargement process along with Germany. There's in essence now leaving because of the immigration that enlargement process created. Here's the country that said it wants to support a strong Eurozone. Not in it, but we want to support it because it's good for us. The declines in the stock market values on continental Europe, I think I'm right in saying, Paolo, were higher than the ones we suffered here. You're hitting the EU when it's not yet out of the Eurozone crisis because of the impact of the loss of the British economy and its connection to the EU. The UK was one of the main architects of the single market, and in a way is now undermining it. It's the country that kept saying global trade deals. We push for TTIP, something that actually undermined a lot of the progressive vote. Even David Cameron saying we must have a free trade deal with China. Pushing the EU in those directions of those trade deals, and now saying, oh, you know what, actually, we want to do our own trade deals. We can have the bright future. It's the proud trading nation, not going to be held back by all of you. We're the country that pushed for the sanctions, that said Russia is the revanchist power. We must get all of these other European governments together. Germany came very much in line. And just at that pivotal moment where actually Germany is now exposed, and Merkel in particular, vis-a-vis Russia, we step back. In a way, that's what we're saying. That's how it's interpreted in European capitals. You look after Russia. We're going to go and look at China and India, nice emerging markets. I could go on with these examples, but I think we've got to be even-handed on this, because if you're sitting amongst those who really pushed for the UK to leave the EU, there's a counter-narrative. And here is an EU that has lectured Britain for the last 3 to 4 years at least about how there are 4 freedoms, and Britain is not going to get its way on destroying the 4 freedoms by getting some special deal on immigration. But, oh, by the way, services markets, I think that's one of the 4 freedoms. Monti report added maybe 30% of the market out there. So the precise area where Britain is most competitive, they have not allowed a free movement on. No one talks about the free movement of services. It's the 4th movement that Britain is constantly beaten over the head over. And it's the area where the UK is most competitive. And where it feels it does not get, therefore, the fair due in global trade agreements, that this is put at the top of the list, just as not at the top of the list here. The EU has been creating fair weather institutions for the last number of years. The Eurozone, which was designed for 2.5% growth, probably, or 2% growth, has ended up creating a suboptimal trading zone, you might argue, on Britain's shore. And by being that, it's actually driven that immigration even more to the UK, which has reformed ahead of the other European economies. Maybe Sweden and Germany obviously has its competitiveness on the manufacturing side. Schengen, another fair weather institution, which by not being combined with serious external border controls or by an effective building up of domestic intelligence and law enforcement coordination, has fed that British fear that just over the water is this ungoverned space that's going to let ISIS and other groups come through. You know, spending 1.5% on average of GDP on defense makes them think NATO is better than the EU. I could go on. And then you just throw the neighborhood in, where actually the countries that have been in a way least supportive of trying to change the balance of economic opportunity between North Africa, Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, all those countries from which a lot of that illegal migration is now coming around from, are actually EU governments that didn't want to open up their markets to Tunisian olive oil or textiles from those countries. So I can see that when you sit from a particular seat in the UK and you look at the EU, that whole business of why bother, comes through. So we're starting, I'll stop here for a second. I mean, we're starting from, I think, a position of mutual incomprehension and loss of trust. And if we don't overcome that trust, ultimately, I think I share Paolo's view. There are a lot of European governments that have just said, sod it. In a way, it's too difficult. You're kind of out in any case. You're not in the Eurozone. You're not in Schengen. You're on the edge. I'm not sure we want you to come back in. Second referendum, change your mind. You'd just be bringing that uncertainty back into us. Let's see if we can forge our future. And on the UK side, there's a sense, at least in the comments made by Jean-Claude Juncker, which is jumping to the we don't trust you anymore, where I think Merkel has been very useful. Angela Merkel has stepped up and said, hold on, stop, diffuse, we need time. And I think time is actually what we need for whatever kind of deal emerges. We can get into what kind of deal emerges. But I just want to raise that point at the beginning of the mutual incomprehension.